Pope Francis, head of the Catholic Church and sovereign of the Vatican city-state, has died.
It's in that spirit that the name of Cardinal Peter Turkson of Ghana has emerged.
Cardinal Peter Turken didn't say a word. Not during the nonstop headlines, not during the endless health scares, and not even in the quiet days leading up to Pope Francis's final breath. But now, that silence is shattered, and what he's just said has sent a wave of shock right through the Vatican. Let's head straight to the Vatican, where crowds of people are still lining up around the clock, slowly walking past Pope Francis's coffin. And while the world mourns, something unexpected happened behind closed doors. Off the record, Cardinal Turken whispered a sentence that stopped people in their tracks. Even the most loyal folks inside the church were left speechless, unsure of what to believe anymore. After holding back for so long, Turken finally spoke out, and what he revealed wasn't just hard to hear. It was raw, it was emotional, and it left everyone deeply rattled. So what really went down in those final days? And who made the call that can't be reversed? By early 2025, it was no secret that Pope Francis's health had taken a turn. What used to be a private concern quietly turned into a full-blown crisis. The world had seen him soldier on for years, dealing with knee pain, surgeries, and constant tiredness. But what happened that February felt different? On Valentine's Day, February 14th, Francis was taken to Rome's Gemelli Hospital after weeks of battling what seemed like a stubborn cough. But it turned out to be much worse than anyone expected. Doctors found he had pneumonia in both lungs, the kind that hits hard and fast. On top of that, tests showed a mix of harmful bacteria had settled in, which made things even riskier, especially for an 88-year-old with a history of lung issues. For the first time since his major surgery in 2021, the Vatican started sounding more cautious. Public statements were short and carefully worded. But behind the scenes, things were far more intense. He was on high-flow oxygen, needed blood transfusions, and whispers began about early signs of kidney trouble. Some even said he'd temporarily stopped breathing, though the Vatican never confirmed that bit. Francis stayed in hospital for over 5 weeks. Every day felt like a question mark. He didn't appear at any windows, no waving to crowds, nothing. For someone who'd spent most of his papacy out and about, this kind of quiet felt eerie. Vatican officials kept saying he was stable, but with no real signs of improvement, plenty of people weren't buying it. Then, on March 23rd, came the surprise announcement. Pope Francis was going home. It sounded like good news, sort of. Relief, yes, but also confusion. Because just days earlier, those close to him had described him as frail, barely able to speak or move. He didn't look anywhere near ready to leave the hospital. Still, they said he'd continue recovering at his residence, the Casa Santa Marta, inside Vatican City. But even there, he stayed mostly hidden. He skipped official meetings, canceled his regular Wednesday address. When he did speak, it was through short written notes or brief pre-recorded clips. For someone known for his off-the-cuff comments and warm, in-the-moment chats, the silence felt heavy. Then came Easter, April 20th. Francis appeared at the famous window of St. Peter's Basilica to give the traditional Urbi et Orbi blessing. But instead of a joyful, uplifting moment, it felt sad. He looked thinner than ever. His voice was barely there. He had to be helped to the window. And even from far away, it was obvious something wasn't right. Still, no one officially said anything. No health update, no statement. Just more silence. As Pope Francis faded further from the public eye, those closest to the Vatican started to worry, not just about his health, but about who was actually calling the shots around him. Why was he sent home so soon? Who gave the green light for his discharge? For a while, no one had answers. The truth, it seemed, was being kept tightly under wraps. Then, on April 21st, just a few weeks after he'd left the hospital, the Vatican quietly released a short, almost clinical statement. Pope Francis had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The cause, they said, was heart failure following complications from a stroke. The world grieved. Flags were lowered. Church bells rang out. But behind the scenes, inside the Vatican's heavily guarded walls, a very different conversation was just beginning. One that wasn't about mourning, but about responsibility. And it wasn't an outsider who started it. It was someone from within, someone who'd kept quiet until now. And the question they asked cut to the heart of everything. What really happened behind those closed doors? After being discharged from Rome's Gemelli Hospital on March 23rd, many hoped Pope Francis was on the road to recovery. Slow perhaps, but steady. But those hopes faded fast. Instead of returning to his usual duties, the Pope more or less disappeared from view. For a man known for showing up, in person, with warmth and spontaneity, his sudden vanishing act felt more than strange. Public audiences were canceled. The traditional Holy Week celebrations, delegated to others. Even people working inside the Vatican began to murmur. Francis, they whispered, was cut off. Tucked away in his private residence at Casa Santa Marta, surrounded by a much smaller, more closed-off group than usual. The official line didn't change. He was resting, recovering, under careful observation. But the lack of any real signs, no sudden pop-ins, no waves from the window, no cheerful Sunday blessings, told a different story. Something felt off. Behind closed doors, the unease grew. People who had worked closely with him started to notice shifts. Longtime aides, faces that had always been by his side, seemed to vanish. Some were said to have been quietly reassigned. In their place appeared unfamiliar people, new assistants, different doctors, fresh advisors, names and faces no one could quite place, and no one explained why. Now, the Vatican has always been a place of protocol and secrecy, sure, but even by its standards, this felt unusually tight-lipped. One insider described the vibe as locked down. Another called it carefully controlled. Journalists covering the Vatican started asking uncomfortable questions. Why hadn't the Pope been seen? Where were the videos, the messages, even a photo? Why weren't there any proper health updates? But their questions were met with the same soft, vague replies. The Holy Father is recovering. He thanks you for your prayers. It became the standard script. Still, if you listened closely, the tone began to shift. The same Vatican officials who'd once spoken proudly of Pope Francis's strength now sounded more cautious, more restrained. They talked about sensitive phases, close monitoring, and the need for rest. The words were clearly chosen to soothe, but they didn't actually explain anything. Privately, some cardinals were getting uneasy. For over 10 years, Pope Francis had built his reputation on openness, being out there among the people, shaking hands, cracking jokes, and never hiding behind red tape. But now it felt like the shutters had come down. Even those who'd stood beside him for years were suddenly out of the loop. One of them was Cardinal Peter Turkson, a longtime ally of Francis and once one of the Church's leading voices for global human development. Turken had kept his thoughts to himself ever since stepping down from his Vatican role back in 2021. He hadn't commented on the Pope's health, nor on the strange goings-on in recent weeks. But he was paying attention. And he wasn't the only one. All across the Vatican, a feeling was growing that something had shifted. And not just in Francis's condition, but in how things were being handled. It seemed like a small group, or maybe even just one person, had quietly taken control of the Pope's care. But were they truly helping him? Or were they keeping him hidden? One day before the Vatican publicly admitted he'd been hospitalized, a Vatican insider spoke off the record to an Italian newspaper. The Pope is tired, they said. Not just physically. He's being kept away. I don't know why. By then, to those who were closest, it was clear. Something wasn't right, and someone else was making the calls. While the world held its breath, offering prayers and waiting for any glimpse or word from the Pope, the Vatican stayed quiet. But that silence wasn't going to last forever. And when it finally broke, it came from someone no one expected, the Cardinal who had vanished. Among the many figures who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Pope Francis, few were as widely respected or as suddenly absent as Cardinal Peter Turken. Born in Ghana and known for his intellect, calm diplomacy, and fierce commitment to social justice, Turken was a rising star in the Catholic Church. Appointed a cardinal by Pope John Paul II back in 2003, and later elevated further by Pope Benedict XVI, he steadily climbed the ranks with quiet confidence. When Pope Francis began his papacy in 2013, Turken quickly became one of his closest allies. He was eventually tapped to lead the Vatican's dicastery for promoting integral human development, a major role that put him at the heart of the Church's outreach on issues like climate change, poverty, and global migration. If the Church was speaking out on human rights or environmental care, chances were Turken was the one holding the microphone. He wasn't just influential. Many thought he was a top contender to become the next pope. Then, out of the blue, he stepped down. It was 2021. Technically, his 5-year term had ended. But for someone so trusted and visible, most expected the Vatican to renew his post, as they often do. Instead, Turken submitted his resignation, and Pope Francis accepted it. No fuss, no public explanation. On paper, it was presented as routine. Behind the scenes, people weren't so sure. After that, Turken returned briefly to Ghana, then settled into a quiet life in Rome. He stopped giving interviews. He refused to comment on church affairs. And even as Pope Francis's health began its slow decline, Turken said nothing. No public prayer, no thoughtful tribute, nothing. As the Pope's hospital stays in February and March 2025 became more serious, people wondered, where was Turken? Given their deep history and shared values, both men champions of the poor, the environment, and a more open church, many expected at least a few words from him. But still, silence. And when Pope Francis died on April 21st, Turken's name was nowhere in the flood of condolences pouring in from religious leaders and dignitaries. The absence stood out. Vatican reporters noticed. One veteran journalist put it bluntly, "When someone as significant as Turken chooses not to speak at a moment like this, it says something. The question is, what exactly?" Over the years, Turken and Francis had appeared tightly aligned, not just in public, but in their vision for what the Church should be. So had there been a falling out? Had Turken stepped away because he saw something others didn't? Rumors swirled. Some said he'd been shut out of important decisions about the Pope's care. Others claimed he'd grown disillusioned with how secretive things had become in those final months. But none of it could be confirmed. Turken didn't reply to the press. Friends said even they couldn't reach him. And then, nearly a week after the Pope's death, his name suddenly popped up on a list of attendees for a small, private memorial mass inside the Vatican. He showed up quietly. No interviews, no photos. He slipped in and out through a side door. But just a few days later, he finally broke his silence. Not through a press release. Not at a podium. Just a soft-spoken, quietly recorded conversation. And what he said rocked the Church to its core. It all came down to a moment in March, the day Pope Francis was discharged from Rome's Gemelli Hospital. At the time, the Vatican painted the move as good news. The official statement was calm and simple. The Pope was resting comfortably and recovering at home. But behind that polished announcement, people who knew the truth were deeply confused. They'd seen him. They'd heard from staff. He wasn't recovering. He was exhausted, frail, barely able to speak. His breathing was still troubled. For those who'd witnessed his condition firsthand, the idea that he was well enough to go home didn't add up at all. The question that had hung silently in the air for weeks, the one few dared to voice publicly, was now spreading in whispers behind closed doors. Who had made the decision to send the Pope home? In most medical cases, especially one involving the leader of the Catholic Church, a discharge would be the result of careful coordination, a team approach. Doctors, senior caregivers, Vatican officials, and perhaps even the Pope himself would normally weigh in. But those close to the situation began suggesting something else entirely, something narrower. Not a consensus, not a group vote, just a signature. According to a medical liaison with knowledge of the Pope's final days at Gemelli Hospital, the discharge order didn't come from a group. It came from one person, a senior physician who had been part of the team assisting with his respiratory care. She wasn't a longtime Vatican doctor. She wasn't a familiar face from the papal household. In fact, she was relatively new to the circle. Quietly brought in to assist during a critical stretch, she had quickly become central to the Pope's care. Colleagues described her as competent, deeply trained, and poised. But some also said she was overly confident, maybe too sure of her judgment. Her name never appeared in any official Vatican bulletin, but it began making the rounds in both medical and clerical circles soon after the funeral. Those who had worked closely with her during the Pope's hospitalization said she believed he was well enough to leave. She argued that returning home to Santa Marta would give him a more peaceful environment, that the clinical setting of the hospital was doing more harm than good. But not everyone agreed. A number of voices inside the hospital reportedly advised waiting. At least another week, they urged. But those voices weren't the ones with the final say. She overruled it, said one source familiar with the hospital's discharge protocols. There was pushback. We said he wasn't ready. She said he understood the risks, that he was lucid, that he wanted to go, and she signed. Then, as if the decision had already been settled, the process unfolded with eerie efficiency. Pope Francis left the hospital quietly, without ceremony. No photographers were allowed near. There were no familiar images of him in a wheelchair, no wave to the faithful, no sign that the world's most watched religious leader had returned home. Just a car, a motorcade, and a closed gate. And then, silence. From March 23rd until Easter Sunday on April 20th, the Pope vanished from public view. There were no brief appearances, no window blessings, not even a pre-recorded message. For someone known for his spontaneous moments and pastoral warmth, the sudden absence was alarming. And when he finally reappeared at the Apostolic Palace window to deliver the traditional Easter blessing, what was meant to be a reassuring sight had the opposite effect. He looked like a man saying goodbye, one observer said. He needed help to stand, struggled to speak with his usual rhythm, and his voice was faint. The image rattled those who loved him, and those who had quietly doubted the wisdom of his discharge weeks earlier. Still, no one asked the hard question publicly. Not yet. But behind Vatican doors, murmurs turned into worry. Some senior clergy wondered whether Pope Francis had truly been capable of making such a serious medical decision. Others questioned whether the doctor had acted too quickly, eager to make a decisive call, even if it meant ignoring more cautious advice. She had likely meant well, they thought. But had she misjudged just how fragile he really was? As the days wore on and his health continued to decline, it became obvious there would be no rebound, no last-minute turn. Less than a month after leaving the hospital, Pope Francis was gone. And suddenly the quiet concern sharpened into urgent questions. Who had been advising him? Who cleared the release? Who silenced the doctors who said wait? And would anyone finally speak up? The answer came softly, from the man who had stayed silent the longest. Peter Turken broke his silence. She killed him. The words weren't shouted. They weren't part of a press conference or a fiery statement to the media. They were spoken quietly, almost painfully, during a closed-door conversation between Cardinal Turken and a trusted journalist, just days after the Pope's funeral. And when that recording leaked to the press, the headline practically wrote itself. Cardinal Peter Turken finally breaks silence, and it's bad. But this wasn't political. It wasn't angry. It was sorrowful. She didn't mean to, Turken said, but she did it. She signed the discharge papers. She said he'd recover better at home. We told her he wasn't ready, but she sent him anyway. The she in question, as confirmed by multiple sources, was indeed the same senior physician who had made the call on March 23rd, the one who signed off on the Pope's final return to the Vatican. Would you like to continue with what followed after Turken's statement leaked? According to Cardinal Turken, and later confirmed by at least 2 medical aides who spoke anonymously, there had been pushback to the Pope's release. Internal hesitation, a quiet unease among those closest to his bedside. Some doctors had urged caution, asking for just a few more days of observation. 1 more week of oxygen therapy, 1 more chance to monitor him before making any final decision. But the physician in charge overruled the concern. She maintained that Pope Francis was alert, lucid, and adamant about returning home. She believed he could continue recovery more comfortably at the Vatican, and so she gave the green light. Turken didn't mince words when he described what happened. His voice in that short recording was heavy with grief. He trusted her, he said. We all did, at first, but she was looking at protocol. Not the man, just the chart. And by the time she finally saw him, really saw what was happening, it was too late. The leaked conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but the effect was immediate. Within hours, the clip had spread across Europe and Latin America. Major news outlets picked it up. Vatican reporters who had followed Turken for decades, many of whom had come to know him as reserved, diplomatic, and unfailingly careful with his words, were stunned. For him to say something this blunt, this unfiltered, meant he believed it with every fiber of his being. And yet, despite the weight of his words, there was no accusation of ill intent. Turken never implied malice. He didn't call for punishment, didn't demand a formal inquiry or even accountability. What he delivered was emotional, not legal. Painful honesty, not political theater. She did it, he said again in the recording's final seconds. Not with her hands, but with her judgment. According to sources inside the Vatican, the doctor at the center of the storm has since vanished from view. No public comments, no interviews, no official identification. She's still employed, but quietly reassigned, no longer in Rome. A silent, internal shuffle. No press release, no acknowledgement. Inside the Roman Curia, reactions were mixed. Some officials felt Turken had crossed a line by speaking so bluntly. Others quietly admitted his words reflected what many had been thinking, but didn't dare to say. He wasn't ready to go, one cardinal said. We all saw it. The Vatican itself refused to comment on Turken's statement directly. A spokesperson issued a brief response, noting only that the Pope had been surrounded by competent medical professionals and received the best care possible. No mention of Turken, no mention of the doctor, just the official line, calm, controlled, unyielding. But the damage had already been done. For many inside the Church, something deeper had cracked. A trust, once unspoken but foundational, had been shaken. If a man like Peter Turken, known for restraint, had reached the point of speaking out, what else had gone unsaid? The world had grieved Pope Francis through candlelit vigils and cathedral bells, through headlines, tears, and memories. But in the days after Turken's words echoed across the media, another kind of mourning took hold, quieter, more disquieting. The realization that the last decision of Francis's life, the one that brought him home, might have been a mistake, that it might have come too early, and that the person who made it might never answer for it. The echoes lingered. Despite the global shock, the Vatican didn't open an investigation. There were no emergency briefings, no clarification, just silence. And that silence, calculated, total, spoke louder than anything Turken had said. The physician, whose name still hasn't been officially acknowledged, was reassigned without fanfare. She was not fired, not reprimanded, just quietly moved to a less visible role. She was never mentioned in funeral addresses, Vatican bulletins, or posthumous tributes to the Pope. She became invisible. But the unease remained. In the Vatican's marble halls, in whispered conversations, and in the growing sense that something sacred had been mishandled in those final days. Would you like me to continue with what happened next? How the Church and the faithful began to grapple with the fallout? Her role, like so many things within the Vatican's heavily guarded world, vanished without explanation. One day, she was central to the most consequential decision of Pope Francis's final days, and the next, she was simply gone. Her presence erased from official mention, her name never spoken publicly. For some, that quiet disappearance marked the end of the story. For others, it opened a far more troubling door. If a pope could be quietly discharged against the advice of several doctors, what else could be kept hidden? Since the leak of the recording, Cardinal Turken has declined all interview requests. He hasn't spoken publicly, hasn't clarified, hasn't walked anything back. Those close to him say he regrets the way the clip emerged, but not the words themselves. One confidant recalled him saying, "I didn't speak to stir scandal. I spoke because the truth had to sit somewhere. Peace needs a place to rest." Inside the church, the response has remained divided. Some see Turken's statement as necessary, a painful reckoning that many had been too afraid to voice. Others believe it was reckless, that it damaged a fragile moment of mourning, that it cast unfair blame. But even those who disagreed couldn't ignore one undeniable fact. The image of Pope Francis on Easter Sunday, weak and ghostly pale in his window, had already disturbed many. Turken didn't create that sense of unease. He simply gave it a name. Among the faithful, the reaction has been no less fractured. Some lit candles and left handwritten notes at churches, thanking Francis for holding on through pain and fatigue. Others, however, started asking more difficult questions. Was he truly ready to go? Did anyone genuinely listen to him in those final conversations? Had he been allowed to decide, or had that choice been made for him? There are no firm answers. Maybe there never will be. What remains is a deeper discomfort, a truth that can't be tidily resolved. In the end, it wasn't politics or papal succession that sent tremors through the church in the wake of Francis's passing. It was a single, quiet sentence, a whispered reckoning from a man who had stayed silent for years, until silence felt like complicity. "She killed him," Turken had said. Not out of hatred, not from cruelty, but through a decision, one made behind a closed door, signed in ink, irreversible. A decision carried out without turning back. And now the church must live with that echo. Was it an act of mercy, or a misstep that ended too much, too soon? Because if even the Pope wasn't protected from that kind of decision, who is?